Please keep us in your prayers. I know the singing thus far has been absolutely phenomenal. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news or to dampen the moment, but today we're going to talk about grief. Today we're going to talk about grief. This last month and a half, I've had to officiate 2 funerals. And one of them was my mother-in-law, and the other was a former elder at the Mesa Church of Christ. And so grief has been on my mind. There was another church here in the valley in which I filled in for them before accepting the position here, where they lost their minister abruptly in his sleep. And he was dear to my heart as well. Actually, him and I worked together to memorialize another member of the church 2 years ago. So grief has been on my mind. Grief has been in my heart. Grief has been just present in my life and in my home for the last couple of months. And so if I'm dealing with grief, if I'm contemplating grief, if grief is having an effect on me, I would imagine that it's having an effect on you. And in this pandemic, grief is unavoidable. People are dying left and right. People are losing their homes. People are losing their jobs. Families and marriages are breaking down. There's so much conflict and turmoil in the political arena in our society. And so grief, unfortunately, is our reality. And many people, since this pandemic, has been grieving in a constant state of grief for the last year and a half, even longer. So today I want to invite you to the subject, good grief. Good grief. If you have your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 34, and we'll look at verses 5 through 7. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 5 through 7. And it reads, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he, being God, buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite of Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eyes undimmed and his vigor unabated." Moses, born a Hebrew, raised as an Egyptian. Moses, the man who met God at a burning bush. Moses, who opposed the Egyptian king. Moses, who was sent by God to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Moses, who emancipated the nation of Israel from Egyptian slavery. Moses, who received the 10 Commandments from God, not once, but twice. Moses, whom the scripture says spoke to God face to face. Moses, who made water pour out of a rock. Moses, who was the architect of the Ark of the Covenant. Moses, who was the architect of the first official place of worship, which was the tabernacle. Moses, who wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses, one of the greatest leaders and prophets of Israel. Moses, who was a type, a figure, or a symbol of the Christ to come. Moses, he lived, he served, he protected, he shepherded, he preached, and led the children of Israel for 40 years through the wilderness. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if you were there and you were a part of the tribe of Israel, of the children of Israel under the leadership of Moses? Could you imagine to wake up and hear one day that Moses has died? And not only has he died, that we don't even know where he's buried, because God himself buried his servant. Could you imagine the devastation? Could you imagine the heartache? Could you imagine the grief that permeated the children of Israel? Let me ask you this morning, church. Have you ever gotten some news that ripped your heart out? Have you ever gotten some news that made your knees buckle, brought you down to the ground? Have you ever gotten some news that snatched your very breath away? Church, have you ever gotten some news that made you question God? That made you question his love? That made you question his grace, his providence, his sovereignty? I want to talk about grief. Grief is something that we all have or will experience in this life. Grief is something you cannot avoid, something you cannot run from, something none of us will be able to escape. And grief has a profound effect on our life. I'm here to tell you this morning that any loss can result in grief. We often think about grief in the context of death, of dying, of losing a loved one or a close friend. But I'm going to tell you, grief can come by way of any significant loss in our lives. And I say this because some people are grieving and don't know that they're grieving because they have not experienced a significant death in their life. Your loss can be major or it can be minor. Your loss can be something material or something symbolic. Your loss can be a person. It could be a possession. It could be a goal or an ambition that is no longer achievable. That can create grief. Your loss could be death. It could be divorce. You know how many people I talk to in my counseling agency and they come to me and I ask them about their past trauma and they skip over the trauma of divorce because it's been normalized. Because 1 out of every 2 marriages end in divorce. And because it's been normalized, they don't think of it being traumatic. But it breeds so much grief. Loss can come by way of cancer, of a career change, of another terminal illness, of trauma, of abuse, a relationship breakup, infidelity, the loss of a bodily function, retirement. So glad Brother Bravo keeps preaching. Even in his retirement. You know, you ever heard of the empty nest syndrome? Where you grow up, you raise kids, they grow up, they leave your home, and now it's just you and your spouse or just you by yourself. Your nest is empty. That's a significant loss. It can breed grief. I'll even say the loss of a pet can breed grief. Any loss can result in grief. So, point number 1 this morning. Point number 1, embrace your grief. And we'll spend the most of the time on this topic, on this point, and we'll look at 2 other points, but I want to emphasize, I want to elaborate, I want to bring attention to this first point. Embrace your grief. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 8. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. Now, let me just preface this by saying there's some people out there who will say weeping and mourning and grieving should only last 30 days because of this particular text. This is not a biblical precedent to limit your days of mourning. Let me just say that. This is cultural. And if you read the scripture, you'll see in other prominent figures' death, they didn't weep and mourn for 30 days. For some, it was 7 days. For some, it was several hours. But 30 days was to signify how important and how detrimental this loss actually was. 30 days was like the maximum time of collective grieving. So what did grief look like for the children of Israel? During this time, they would hire professional mourners to help with the grieving process. Mourners would chant songs of mourning. They would light candles. They would spend time in the home of the family. They would pray with the family. They would grieve with the family for 30 days. And when these mourners would grieve with the family, it was normal to hear these loud wails of crying, of screaming, of emotional outpours. In some instances, they would beat their chest. They would tear their clothes. They would shave their heads. They would put ashes over their face, over their skin, over their clothes. They would avoid entertainment. They would avoid marital relations. They took time to grieve. This was public grieving. In other words, everybody could see it. Everybody knew about it. This was collective mourning, which means we did it as a group. We did it as a tribe. We did it as a culture, as a society, as a community. I wish we had that type of grieving today. Today's world, we're told to grieve alone. We're encouraged to grieve in isolation. And it's hurting us. It's not helping. Church, let me tell you, just like this cultural grief was unique and different from how we know grief here in America, every individual person's grieving is unique as well. There is no cookie cutter method to grief. Everybody's grief will look different. So we ought to be careful not to impose our way of grieving on the grief of others. Everybody's grief is unique. And that means we ought to avoid comparing our grief to someone else's grief. There is no magic recipe for grief. So what are some misconceptions? Misconceptions about grief. I want to do a little call and response. So as I blurt out this misconception, I want you to say, no, you don't. Okay? Let me see if you can do it. Let me just repeat after me. No, you don't. No, you don't. Okay, good. If you're online, just type it in the comments. So here's some misconceptions of grief. So remember, after I say it, you say, no, you don't. So misconception number 1, you need to get over it. No, you don't. Good job, good job. Misconception number 2, you need to find a replacement. No, you don't. No, you don't. Misconception number 3, you need to keep busy. No, you don't. Misconception number 4, you need to be alone until you feel better. No, you don't. You need to avoid all reminders of your loss. No, you don't. But don't we say these things to people who are grieving? In fact, I can be honest, I'm guilty of saying some of these things myself, and I'm a therapist. But these are misconceptions about grief that don't help anyone in their grieving process. In fact, it makes you unrelatable. Let people feel what they feel. Let people grieve how they grieve. You know, some people won't let you grieve because they have not processed their own grief. In fact, some people are so uncomfortable with negative feelings And because they feel uncomfortable, they don't want you to feel that way. Your grief makes them feel uncomfortable, so they tell you, get over it, or move on, or this too shall pass, or it's going to be okay. It dismisses what we feel, and it's a disconnect. Church, let me tell you, grief is not something you get over. Let me repeat that. Grief is not something you get over. Grief is not something you move on from. Grief is something you move on with. Time does not heal all wounds. In fact, if you have a terminal illness, it may get worse as time progresses. The same is true with grief. You don't really heal from grief. Time doesn't heal grief. Time passes as you experience grief from day to day. Some people believe that if they feel their grief, they won't be able to function. In other words, I've heard people say, I don't want to give in to grief out of fear that I will lose control of myself. In other words, if I feel the grief, I'm going to act out of control. It's a false reality. Actually, when you suppress your grief, when you suppress the grieving process, you actually become more out of control. When you suppress your grief, research shows that you become more anxious. When you suppress your grief, you become easily agitated. You're more on edge. You're more hostile. You have sleep disturbances. You're more likely to engage in unnecessary conflict. In other words, you become more dysfunctional when you suppress your grief. That's when you're out of control. Feel your grief. Embrace your grief. Grief is not an emotion. Let me say that again. Grief is not an emotion. Many people think it is, but it's not. Grief is a state of being flooded with emotional experiences. Grief is a state of mind. It's a state of being where emotions flood your mind, where they interrupt your life, where it makes it difficult to function from day to day. When the sadness hits you, the depression hits you. It's an emotional experience, but grief itself is not an emotion. Church, emotions come and go. You can be happy one minute, sad the next. You can be angry, you can be content. You can be embarrassed, you can feel grief. You can be ecstatic, you can be depressed. Emotions come and go. They're like waves in the ocean. Here one minute, gone the next. But grief is different. Grief stays with you. It doesn't really come and go. Grief seems to linger on after the loss has occurred. Grief can be present for weeks, for months, for years, even an entire lifetime. That's how profound and impactful grief is. It leaves a void. If it's a significant loss, it leaves a void in your heart that nothing else can fill. And it stays with you to the day you die. And some of you may say, I've never felt that kind of pain. I've never experienced that before. Keep living. Keep living. Grief is not an emotion. How do you know this? Well, researchers have tried to give those with complicated grief or bereavement antidepressants, thinking, grief is just another form of depression. And if we give them antidepressants, well, we expect that the grief will lift. Guess what research shows? It doesn't. Antidepressants does not eliminate grief. The grief stays. It may help deal with some of the depression, the clinical depression that comes along with it, but the grief lingers. That's how we know now that grief is not an emotion. So when it comes to grief, what do? We visit our emotional experience of grief, but we don't live there. Grief is something we visit. We visit the emotional experience of it. In other words, feel your sadness. Feel your heartache. Feel your heartbreak. Feel it. Feel the despair. Feel the pain of the loss, but don't live there. Just visit there from moment to moment. Church, good grief. What does good grief look like? If you've experienced a significant loss and you can get out of bed, church, that's good grief. If you've experienced a significant loss and you can find the energy to take a shower, that's good grief. If you can get up every morning and brush your teeth, that's good grief. If you can still get up and go to work in the morning, that's good grief. If you can still answer your phone when somebody calls you, church, that's good grief. If you still are eating 3 meals a day, that's good grief. If you can still pray, that's good grief. If you can still worship, that's good grief. Let me tell you, church, sometimes doing the small thing when you've experienced a loss in your life is actually a big thing. If you can still engage in personal hygiene, church, that's good grief. If you can still go to the grocery store and fulfill your grocery list, that's good grief. Let me tell you, church, for some people, they can't do it. They're absolutely debilitated. Good grief. Let me just say this when we move on to our next point. Love and grief are intertwined. If there's no love, there's no grief. You ever been to a funeral and you wanted to pay respects, but you really didn't have a relationship with that person? There's this detachment, this dissonance, right? Where you don't feel really emotional, you don't feel too sad, you're just there to kind of support the family because you didn't know the person, you didn't have a relationship with them. It's because you didn't love them. You didn't experience life with them, so the grief isn't there. But if you do have grief, that grief is telling you that you were in love. You don't grieve what you have not loved, especially when it comes to a person. Grief is a natural response. Grief is the preservative of a love that is now gone. Does that make sense? Grief is the evidence that you were in a loving relationship with someone who is no longer there. So I want you to start thinking differently about grief. Well, grief is really saying, I had a relationship that was real. I had a relationship that was significant, that was authentic, that was genuine, a relationship that impacted me to my core. That grief is saying you were in love. Here's some grieving tips really quick. 7 tips to deal with your grief. Number 1, revisit pictures and videos with the attitude of gratitude. Be thankful. Be thankful that God gave you this person for a moment in time. Number 2, focus on fond memories and experiences with this person, and then talk about them with someone you trust. Number 3, write letters to the person you have lost. It's a form of journaling. Number 4, create a memorial or a grief box. My clients love this one. So you take things that remind you of this person and you put it all in a box. You can decorate the box, whatever you can think of that gives you positive memories and experience with this person. Whenever you think about them, you take the box out. And you set aside that time to grieve and to be thankful that that person was in your life. Number 5, set aside time daily, sometimes weekly or monthly, to grieve. Because grief is so intrusive and it'll disrupt your entire day. Set aside time to grieve on purpose. Number 6, create a new routine or ritual in dedication to the person you lost. Here's some personal disclosure. Lost my grandfather. It was devastating. Talked to him on the phone the day he died. Got off the phone with him. He had a heart attack immediately. One thing my grandfather and I always did together was go to Cracker Barrel. After he died, I decided, you know what, every Thursday we're going to Cracker Barrel. And we did that to help me get into a routine and to dedicate something to him in my life. And we did that for years. And it helped with the grieving process. Number 7, self-care. Don't forget to eat. Get sleep, but not too much and not too little. Engage in personal hygiene, exercise, and take some time away when you need to. Point number 2, embrace the new you. Embrace the new you. In Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Beginning part of verse 1, after the death of Moses, and then Moses, my servant, is dead. That's 2 times the death of Moses is mentioned in this short passage. Now therefore, arise and go over this Jordan, and you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. You first have to admit that a loss has occurred. In order to embrace the new you, in order to embrace the grieving process, you have to admit a loss has occurred. It's mentioned twice here in this passage. The death of Moses, the death of Moses. You got to come to grips with the loss of your life. You got to admit that it has happened. Sometimes we get stuck in the phase or the stage of denial and shock, where we refuse to accept this loss has occurred. And that only prolongs the grieving process. And it really tortures you longer than you need to be tortured. Following the death of Moses, Joshua's role and responsibilities were forever changed. He was no longer an apprentice to Moses. He was no longer an aide or an assistant or a mentee to Moses. Now Joshua has been elevated. He is now a leader for the children of Israel. He is now the chief commander of the children of Israel. He is the spiritual model, the protector for the children of Israel. I could imagine that Joshua, now that Moses is dead, had to change his mindset about his role. I'm sure he had to change his mindset about his strategy and his expectations of himself. He was now in a role that he had never been in before. Church, grief is the response to a loss. But if the loss is permanent, then the grief is permanent. Does that make sense? If the loss is permanent, the grief is permanent. And if grief changes you, that means you are permanently changed. Loss and grief changes you. Your perception of the world changes, does it not? Your identity changes. What you think about life changes. Your responsibilities change. Your priorities change. Your relationships change. Sometimes they go deeper. Sometimes they terminate. They dissolve. Maybe the way that you relate to your family is now different. With a person that has gone off to be in eternity, maybe they were the spiritual leaders. And now that baton or that torch is passed to you. Maybe they were the wise counsel. Maybe they were the function in the dysfunction. And now that they're gone, somebody has to step to the plate. And so then your role changes. People have different expectations of you. Your priorities change. I've heard those who have had significant loss in their lives say, I will never, ever be the same again. And there's some truth to that. we move on, those who are alive, we move on with this void in our hearts. And then we start to understand what really matters in life. You know, sometimes it takes a significant loss for us to learn how to be more compassionate towards others. Church, let me tell you something. Growing up, I did not cry. As a baby, I was told I cried a lot. Once I became self-aware, I didn't cry much. And I noticed it even more through my preteen and teenage years. In my early adulthood, I was not a crier. It took a lot for me to cry. But when my grandfather died, give you a little context. My father did not raise me. He was not in my life. I lived next door to my grandparents my entire childhood. So my grandfather was my father. When he died, I cried all the time. I'm going to tell you, I can look at a movie, and if they have cancer in it, the waterworks are coming on. I can hear about a person's situation. I've just become a crier. I'm more compassionate, more empathetic because of the loss in my life. And that has enabled me to be relatable to other people and to empathize with them and to mourn with them. Here's a quote that I really like. It says this: "And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain. When you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in." That's what the storm is all about. Grief will change you. Embrace the new you. My last point. Embrace your future. Embrace your future. Joshua chapter 1, verse 2. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise." Interesting. This is a commandment from God. Arise. In other words, the implication is you're not standing up. You're laying down. You're kneeling. You're grieving. You're prostrate. Arise. Stand up and go over to this Jordan. You and all this people, and to the land that I'm giving to them, to the people of Israel. The psalmist says in Psalms 30, verse 5, that weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. Amen. Your emotions will not last forever. Good days are coming. Good days are coming. God is telling the children of Israel, now is the time. I know you're grieving. I know you're hurt. I know your leader has just died. It's painful. He says, but get up. Get up. I got a promise to fulfill that I made to your servant Moses. And the promise was to take you to the promised land. And he says, Moses had to die for you to go to the promised land. In other words, Moses had to die for me to fulfill my promise to you. Embrace your future. God uses death to put us directly in our purpose. Church, let me encourage you this morning that you may have loss in your life. You may be grieving right now. And I'm going to tell you, God still has a purpose for you. God still has a mission for you. Hundreds, even thousands of ministries and support groups and advocacy groups and programs have their roots in trauma and grief. People have taken their grief and it has propelled them forward with passion and with purpose. We honor the loss in our life when we choose to live life with a renewed purpose and passion. Embrace the future. Let your loss bring you life. Let your loss bring you life. Let your grief renew your goals. Every Israelite that came out of Egyptian bondage, you know what happened to them? They died. Everyone over the age of 20 who came out of Egyptian bondage, led by Moses, they died because of their lack of faith, because of their rebellion. They died in the wilderness. And because Moses chose to give in to his anger and act impulsively and strike the rock instead of speak to it, he lost out on the promised land as well. And so all these people, thousands and thousands of people, even Moses himself, could not enter the promised land because of their disobedience, because of their lack of self-control, their lack of faith. But you know who was able to enter the promised land? Who was there from the beginning? Joshua and Caleb. The only two. Joshua and Caleb, and then the younger generation at the time who were 20 years and younger, they were able to enter the promised land. And what I'm trying to say is sometimes death has to happen for God to fulfill his promise towards us. I know that's a hard saying, that's something hard to wrap our mind around. But let me ask you, is there something in your life that needs to die? Is there something in your life that's causing you to rebel against God? Is there something in your life that is showing up where it's identifying a lack of faith in your life? What in your life has to die so that God can put you in your purpose? What in your life has to die so that you can enter your promised land? What in your life has to die so God can bless you the way that he wants to bless you? I'm not talking to your grief at this point. I'm talking to your soul. What has to die? In Romans chapter 8, verse 13, says this: for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit of God, you put to death the deeds of the flesh, of the body, you will what? You will live. What is Paul saying here? He's saying when you have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, this Spirit enables you to put to death the deeds of the flesh, the deeds of this body, so that you can live. So that you can live in expectation of the promised land, which is heaven. How do you receive the Spirit? If you don't have the Spirit of God in you, then you really can't put to death the deeds of the flesh, can you? Because he said this is something that the Holy Spirit does. In Acts chapter 2, verse 38, he that believeth, if you repent, you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you are baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, you will receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. You ready to die today? Are there some things in your life that you know you can't put to death without divine influence? I encourage you to submit yourselves in faith to baptism. What's stopping you? You know, God grieves too, right? God grieves too. In fact, Jesus came, Isaiah 53. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? This is a prophecy of Jesus, our suffering servant. For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of a dry ground. And he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by man. Listen to this: a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, and he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Verse number 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. This is what Jesus did on the cross. He took the grief of sin. He took the grief of living in this fallen world. He took the grief that we haven't been separated from God, and he took it to the cross. And he placed our grief, our sorrow on himself. And he says, let me reconcile you back to God. And that's only necessary through my sacrifice, through my blood. Let me tell you something, church. Jesus grieved. You know when he did his most of his grief took place in that garden. You know that? Not on the cross, in the garden. And I'm about to close, but I just got to talk about this for a second. Think about this. Jesus was in relationship with God before the world was created. We talked about this a week ago. That Jesus was existing in perfect unity and love with God, the Holy Spirit, and himself in the Holy Trinity. Right? So could you imagine being in a relationship with someone for eternity? Eternity. You can't count to eternity. You can't subtract from eternity. In fact, eternity is really an abstract idea. It's infinity. Imagine Jesus, as the Word, is in perfect relationship with God for an infinite amount of time. Then he comes on earth, puts on flesh, and goes to the cross, knowing that he's going to die for the sins of the world. And when he took on our sin that separated him, it severed the relationship between him and God the Father. This is the first time in eternity that Jesus, that God will experience separation from his Father. I don't think we really understand the significance of that and how profound and impactful that is. For eternity, all you know is relationship with your Father. And then one day, in a moment in time, that relationship, boom, severed. Could you imagine the grief, the pain, the heartache of after being in a relationship with someone for forever, that all of a sudden it's not there anymore? To never experience that before? Could you imagine the trauma, the grief, the anxiety? That's why I believe Jesus sweat drops of blood. He was about to experience something he had never experienced before when he took our sins to that cross. And that was separation from his Father for the first time in eternity. That's the grief that he bore for us because we were separated from the Father. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. If you're here today, what do you need to die to? You need to die to self? Do you need your sins washed away? The water is always ready. Are you here today and maybe you've taken an inventory of your life and said, there are some things that is keeping me from God fulfilling his promise for me because I'm not ready to let some sin go? I encourage you, confess that, acknowledge it. We'll pray for you. We'll support you. We'll encourage you. If you're here today and you need to respond in any way, I want you to do so now as we all together stand, sing the song of invitation. Thank you.
He will carry you through. I know he will. He'll carry you through. He will. He'll carry you through. I know he will. He'll carry you. So why don't you ask the Savior to help? You will comfort, strengthen, and keep you. I know he is willing to aid you, and he will carry you through. Yield not to temptation, for yielding is sin. Indeed, his victory will help you. will fight manfully on the word God and patience subdue. And look ever to Jesus, and He will carry you through. So why don't you ask the Savior to help you